Mom, first thing I want to do is I want to sort of like get a sense of like what we mean at what we're thinking about like in our life and like our minds when we think about the word apocalypse.
The first things that come to my mind are barren landscapes, blown out buildings, people walking long distances.
Oh, so kind of like the nuclear apocalypse sort of thing.
And
hello, beloved survivors. I'm Autumn Brown, and this is How to Survive the End of the World, a podcast about surviving apocalypse with grace, rigor, and curiosity. The other voice you're hearing is my eldest child, Finn. We've been recording a lot of conversations about apocalypse preparedness, and because we just moved from a 5-acre plot of land in the woods to an apartment in the city, we are thinking and talking a lot about home and making home.
I know I've been actually watching a lot of zombie movies lately, and one of the things I notice in TV and movies about apocalypse is that oftentimes the way we imagine an apocalypse happening, there's some kind of
government issues.
There's government issues, for sure. There's some kind of new disease or monster that people don't know how to fight.
AKA
Godzilla mode, zombies, or some sort of virus. And there's also like an element of people having to forge alliances with whoever they happen to be with, not necessarily the people that they would have chosen to be with.
The ongoing crisis of the coronavirus pandemic reminds us that when disasters unfold, many of the most tragic aspects are due to existing systems and their oppressive impacts. This moment, where people across the world are desperately trying to stave off the worst outcomes of COVID-19, the pressure we are experiencing arises in large part from the lack of infrastructure and supports that would make it possible for people to social distance safely, including and especially guaranteed housing. In this episode, we turn our attention on the issue of housing specifically, naming how people make a home when they can't afford to rent or buy, or when the conditions of the world require that we find safe harbor, regardless of whether we can pay. In recent months, we've seen an increase in the efforts of houseless people to convert abandoned or vacant homes into free or affordable housing, an activity popularly referred to as squatting. Late last year, a group of houseless mothers in Oakland, under the coalition Moms for Housing, took over a vacant, corporate-owned property. After they were evicted, they successfully secured backing from the governor to require that the Bay Area property be sold to a community land trust. In March, families in Los Angeles occupied at least 12 vacant homes under the banner Reclaiming Our Homes. Today, we bring you a special conversation with my comrade Vikki Law, who was active in the squatters' rights struggle in New York City in the 1990s. Vikki Law is an author and journalist focused on mass incarceration. She is the author of Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, co-author of Prison by Any Other Name, The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reform, and author of the forthcoming Prisons Make Us Safer and 20 Other Myths About Mass Incarceration. Vikki began squatting in the 1990s, and in the early 2000s, she helped her building convert from an illegal squat to a limited income co-op. She currently lives with her daughter in the same apartment in their now legalized building. Now, before we jump in, I want to offer some context for the conversation you are about to hear. The squatters' rights movement in New York City arose in the 70s and 80s. It was a time when real estate in many parts of New York City was much cheaper than it is now, obviously, and when landlords realized that they could get more money for their real estate if they torched the buildings and collected insurance. So a lot of landlords set fire to their buildings. Some would also just abandon them. And the city of New York would seize those buildings for non payment of taxes, but often they would just remain empty. So in the 80s, a lot of folks started looking at these empty buildings as a solution for affordable housing. Now, of course, at the time, just the same as it is now, the lines to get into state subsidized affordable housing were years long. So there were houseless people in New York City who just decided, hey, let's break into these abandoned buildings and rebuild them from the inside. And because of this enormous wave of abandonment in the 70s, the city was really slow to act. As you'll hear in Vikki's story, the squatters' rights movement that happened in the 80s and 90s in New York was not always a cohesive movement. Often on the same street, you had squats that were filled with people who were really just getting by, and squats that were filled with people who were acting from a shared political ideology that housing was a human right and that property is theft. Regardless of their political leanings, these folks had to learn a lot of skills. They learned how to replace the joists that hold up a floor and how to lay new floors. They learned to build staircases, to run electricity and water into buildings, to build walls, to build ceilings, and so much more. Vikki tells the story of how the building she moved into as a squat, called Serenity, became her permanent home. And she shares the lessons she learned from this experience that could be applicable to our time, to this pandemic moment. Let's take a listen.
I started squatting in the East Village, Lower East Side in 1996. So this was a time in which gentrification had not hit anything east of Avenue A. The neighborhood I squat in used to be known as Alphabet City in the 1970s and 80s, and there were avenues A, B, C, D, and then the East River. And the common refrain among people who were concerned about safety was you never go east of Avenue A. So I moved into a building that had been squatted in the late 1980s. My building had electricity, which was good. A lot of and we had legal electricity. Some buildings had electricity that was not legal, meaning that somebody would actually go into the manhole and like connect the building to existing electricity. I'm not an electrician. I don't really know how this works, but
Wow.
and then every once in a while, Con Edison would come and clip clip the wires, and they always did this during the coldest part of the winter. So people who are relying on space heaters would then be really cold. Also, you just feel colder when there is just no light ever in your house.
Right.
I don't know why that is, but the psychology of winter is that if it is dark, you are cold. So there were buildings that didn't have electricity. There were some buildings that didn't have water, and it was a major.
And when you say that you all had legal electricity, did that mean that not only was it hooked up by Con Edison, but you also were
paying for it?
Yes. For it?
We were also paying for the electricity with varying degrees of success because it was one big collective pool. So what you do when, like, say, if you're in a building of 20 people, 15 people consistently pay, but then 5 people consistently don't. Then that means that the other 15 people keep having to put in more to make sure that the Con Ed bill stays on. And sometimes our Con Ed got shut off because we could not make that amount. Hence, again, it really sucks to be dark and cold in the winter. We also had water in our building, which was put in before my time. So I think I lucked out in that I moved into a building that was relatively finished. And the following year, in 1997, somebody who lived in another apartment in the same building was planning to, move in with his girlfriend and wanted to have somebody stay in his place. In the squatted buildings, it was a no-no to just leave your apartment empty. Like, say you wanted to go away for 3 months, go visit family, go traveling, go hop a train and, go to California or something, go pick blueberries in Maine. You had to put somebody in your place, in your space. It was really frowned upon to do what we called warehousing, which was to have an empty space. Like if your space was empty, it meant that you didn't need it, and therefore it should go to somebody else.
Right.
Which is kind of along the lines of like, this building was empty, somebody should live in it. And like
Right.
on the micro level, it's like your apartment has been empty for 3 weeks. Do you not need this apartment? Because if so, there's lots of other people who need a place to live that should be able to live in that apartment. So he
It's
was.
so interesting because it's like it's such a like yeah, it's like a whole different culture and ideology about use of space. Whereas I think like for people who privately own their space, they take it as like an assumed part of their reality that they should be able to leave that space at any time for however long with the assumption that no one would ever enter it,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that they can do what they want with that space. Whereas in the squatter community, people were saying, like, if you leave this for 3 months and there's nobody in there, it kind of means that you don't actually really need it. So fast forward to 1999, 2000, and several squats had been evicted since then. The neighborhood was becoming more gentrified. It was not fully like full on gentrification like it is now, but it was becoming more gentrified. And people in the squatted buildings knew that like our time was running out. So in the 1980s, before my time, there used to be a program called the Tenant Interim Lease Program, run by the city of New York, in which tenants who lived in buildings that landlords had abandoned. So if you were a tenant in a building and your landlord just like wasn't taking care of anything, like you were doing all the repairs yourself, they were totally absent, could apply to the city program called the TIL program, in which you fixed up your building and the city awarded it to you and you got your building. And it was a way to reward people who stuck it out and were able to like build homes in these buildings that had been abandoned by landlords. So they weren't squatting the building. Like there were people with
Right.
leases,
They were like
and
existing tenants who had been abandoned by their landlords.
yes.
Gotcha.
But
Mhm.
the city, for some reason, I don't know why, somebody else can probably tell you this, or some listeners can probably look this up, stopped the program. So come 1999, 2000, some squatters call one of these nonprofit developers and say, hey, how would we get into this tenant interim lease program? Because what I should add is the city of New York had a policy of not talking to squatters. They did not negotiate with squatters. They did not have discussions or conversations about, whether or not people could stay or not stay. Their policy was, if we know that you're squatting and we're acknowledging this, it is because we are evicting you. Not that we're going to try to sit down at a negotiation table and say, well, if you agree to X, we'll give you Y. They said, nope, our
Right,
policy
like the
is.
city can't be seen as like in any way
Mhm.
endorsing or acknowledging the right to be there from their perspective.
Exactly.
Got
The city of New York and many media at the time often framed squatters as they're cutting the line for affordable housing. They should just stand in this decade-long line with everybody else. And there was never any acknowledgement of the fact that squatters took over buildings that nobody else wanted. Squatters put a ton of work into their buildings to make them habitable. Again, like I am sitting, on a floor that has been rebuilt by people who squatted, not by, it's not the original floor that the landlord abandoned that fell down.
Right.
So yeah. So the city of New York did not negotiate with squatters. That's why some squatters reached out to a nonprofit developer, hoping that they would be the ones to negotiate the buildings getting into the tenant interim lease program. What they were told was, sorry, the tenant interim lease program has been discontinued for 20 years. There's no way you can get into it. And they said, but let's see if we can negotiate with the city to have them award us the buildings to make them into low income housing. And the wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or housing for low income people. And the wink, wink, nudge, nudge of this conversation was going to be, neither side was going to acknowledge that there were squatters already there, and that these squatters would be the people who were going to then occupy these low income apartments forever and ever. So the city agreed to this. So there were meetings. So, to kind of speed up the timeline, we had meetings in every building. People voiced their apprehensions. I mean, some people were very worried about, like, if we had to take out a bank loan, would the bank then foreclose on our building? Especially those of
Right.
us who knew that collective payment of bills was not always feasible. Some people, I'm sad to say, wanted to hold out because one of the stipulations would be that this was going to be what they called affordable housing in perpetuity, or what is the term called? A house in New York, we have something called a Housing Development Funds Corporation, HDFC, which means that you cannot sell your apartment for whatever the market will bear. You can only sell your apartment for a certain amount of money, and you can only sell to people who make under a certain amount of money. So I can't sell my apartment for $1 bazillion to Jeff Bezos because, there's an income cap. So Jeff Bezos makes way over the income cap. I can't even sell it to a corporate lawyer, who makes less than Jeff Bezos, but more than, say, somebody who's, making the average amount of money would make. And I definitely can't sell it for as much as the market will bear. So some people, I'm sad to say, did not like this. And these were people
because they wanted to be able to have the option to make a profit off of
to
the
make as much
building.
money as they possibly could and then skedaddle. So I'm sad to say that, in movements, sometimes when you dangle $1 in front of people, like they get very, very excited, and all of these ideals and things that we had like long fought for and chanted and like protested outside of various developers and housing places and the city all kind of went out the window, and housing as a human right suddenly became, I should have the right to make money off my apartment. Yes. So
I can imagine that was like, a really painful moment in the organizing process.
It was, especially because these were people, again, whom you come up with and you build community with, and you've protested and you've like fought the police and protested evictions and, like barricaded yourself with and sat in, oh my God, so many meetings with, about like about legal strategies and eviction defense and everything else, and court watch and court defense and legal support and all these things. And then you're like, wait, did those 10 years of us all being in these things mean nothing to you? What, like, so that was disheartening. But for the most part, the building signed on. But then when this deal with the city was on the horizon, guess who suddenly became squatters? Yes. And then later on, they took a buyout from a developer to all to allow him or her or corporation, whatever the developer was that was building a giant glass monstrosity. They took this buyout to so that the developer could like incorporate their building into this giant glass monstrosity that they were building. So again, like I said, it wasn't one cohesive movement where everybody was under the banner of like housing is a human right, property is theft, because from the get-go there were some people who perhaps just wanted to like, kick back, drink, do drugs, and just live, which is fine. And then there were some people who apparently were homesteaders, not squatters, who would very
I mean,
gladly.
and also like homesteaders is such a fucking like colonizer term to use. It's just like, wow.
Yes. And so, and then there were the rest of us who, were like, oh, you mean that I can actually put kitchen cabinets in, or I might actually build a bathroom and not worry that my house is going to be evicted next week, and the hundreds of dollars I just paid to like put in a toilet and a sink in my house would just go down the drain. Like I could actually make improvements to my living situation and not worry about this, about the cops kicking down my door and just throwing me out on the street. That's fantastic. And so, at least for me, it was, and I think for many people, it was a sense of permanence. Like, this is what we've long fought for. We fought for housing. We fought for a place to live. And when we were squatting, there's always the sense of this could go away.
at any moment.
Or maybe
right?
not this could go away, because that seems very passive. This could be taken away from us very violently without notice.
Right.
Like in 1997, there was a squat on Fifth Street that caught on fire in February. It was a really nice day in February. It was a sunny day. Everybody went outside. Everybody wanted to enjoy the nice day. And somebody accidentally left their space heater on. And that space heater, there was an electrical fire. Something happened. Anyhow, there was a fire. People couldn't get into the guy's apartment because he had just put in this really nice fireproof steel door, which would have been great, except that his ceiling didn't have any sheetrock. So of course, when the fire started, it just the flames just went up to the next floor and the next floor and the next floor. So there was not a way to like easily put out the fire. People called the fire department. The fire department came. They put out the fire, but then they also came with the police, who vacated the building. They were like, nope, nobody can come in. And then they set up a watch on the building, and everybody who had gone out to enjoy the nice day came back to find out that they were homeless, and all their stuff and their pets were in there, and they were not allowed to go in and get them. So this was the kind of temporality that we lived with, is that, this could happen to you. You could go out to enjoy the first nice day of the year, and then something dumb like that could happen. So it's not like you got an eviction notice and you said, I got 30 days to get my things in order. It's like, I went out and I came back and my 2 dogs are in there and you won't let me get my dogs. Like one guy got arrested trying to climb the fire escape to get his dogs out of the out of his apartment, because he was like, "There,
so heartless." Yeah.
Like at the very least, can you let me get my dogs out of there?" And they were like, "No." So this was a kind of like sense of, you might not always have this. So this idea of legalizing the building, and the buildings would become ours. Like we would become HDFC shareholders, in which everybody owns a part of the building. Nobody can sell for more than X amount of money. You can't sell for market rate. You can't sell to rich people, and it would be a source of like housing and stability for people. And that is what I think a lot of us wanted. Also, keep in mind at this point, like some of us were getting older, and I mean by older, sometimes it would be like people in their 40s. I think I was like the ripe old age of like 23, at the time, but I was also, newly pregnant. So this idea that like, oh, I don't have to worry about taking my baby out and then like coming back and finding out that I'm homeless. Yeah. Much better than
sounds great.
yeah, much better than being than being in this constant like state of panic that I've got to like take everything out with a diaper bag, take all the important papers, take all my clothes, take everything else. So we ended up doing this, going through this process, and it was a long process. We had to get the buildings up to code. We had to go over things like in terms of like architecture and engineers and everything else, to say like, like what needs to happen in these buildings to get them up to code. Like they could no longer be like sort of like squatter aesthetics and squatter, engineering. Like you actually had to have things that were like, if a city inspector came, or a Department of Buildings inspector came, they would be like, yes, this is actually the way that you like run your plumbing from like the basement all the way up to the top floor. This is the way your roof should look. It should, like, so it was a really long process, and there were like lots of hiccups and fits and starts. But at the end of it, I think that 9 or 10 buildings became HDFC, became legalized, and became housing development fund corporations or co-ops. But again, this was like out of the like however many tens of buildings had originally been squatted in the 1980s.
Wow. That is just such an incredible story, Vikki. It's just like, and I mean, both I just so appreciate all of the history and context that you just offered, in addition to like such specific, clear examples of what it actually looked and felt like to go through this. And yeah, and just thinking about you too as like newly pregnant and a mom or becoming a mom and being a part of this inflection moment where
Mm-hmm.
it was possible for these buildings to become co-ops,
Yes.
is just, it's such a momentous story. And I hope you have a memoir coming. So,
Well, I also want to add that
yeah.
even though like these buildings were in the kinds of conditions where you would think that only people who were like uh, physically able would live in them, people of all types of abilities and ages lived in them. So you had people who were raising children in the squats as well. Like when I moved into this building, there were 4 single parents, all with kids the same age. No, there were 5. 4 of them had little girls, all the same age. They were like age 4 or something when I moved in. And then there was one woman who was a single mom that had a 11-year-old, I think. I think he was 11, so he was older than like the little pack of little girls that we also had. So it was also a way for people to be able to like raise families, uh, and also be able to pursue whatever they wanted to do. So I think 2 of the single dads were musicians. One woman was an aspiring filmmaker. So there were different ways in which people could then say, like, I'm going to continue doing the things that I find meaningful, and I'm also able to raise my child and not have to work a bazillion hours in order to afford rent. And then there was a sense of community too. Like, like if you move into a building where there are a whole bunch of kids your kids' age, then they can all hang out and play together. Like you can
Right.
also like swap out on babysitting, or you can ask other people to watch your kid. Like I ended up watching, I think, almost all of the little girls at some point or another because I was in college and I said, well, I need a place to study anyway. I'm staying home. I'm not going out to the show or the party or whatever. If you want to go for a few hours, all you got to do is, have your kid be ready to go to sleep, and I can just sit here and read. It's fine.
Right.
Like there's
Right.
a, you know,
What you're describing is like, it's in some ways it sort of sounds like the best of the best of all possible worlds,
Mhm.
because it's like people who are parents, people who are non-parents, people who are in a shared commitment to like help each other
Yes.
raise children, um, where like some of the issues that as a parent you're going to have to
Mhm.
navigate can be centered in a situation like that.
Yeah. I mean, also, people figured things out.
After the break, more of my conversation with Vikki, but first, some listener audio. We asked you to record your strategies for intimacy and connection to other humans during this time of social distancing. The voice you're about to hear is one of our listeners named Patrick.
Hello, my name is Patrick. I'm a substitute teacher for elementary school and a Zoom instructor. And during this time of social distancing, I'm really focused on my garden. I'm planting lots of seeds. It's springtime, so it's the perfect time to do that, even if it's not a good time for anything else. I'm also planting some trees and cultivating cuttings of raspberries and working on spreading as much food as possible onto what space I have available. So that when this period of time, social distancing ends, I'll have lots of fresh food to share in the summer when we all reconnect as human people in the world. Thank you for your podcast. Stay strong. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Patrick, for sharing your story. Listeners, we love hearing from you, so keep your memos coming. Again, what are your strategies for intimacy and connection to other humans during this time of social distancing? Let us know by recording audio into the voice memo app on your phone or wherever you have a voice memo app, and then emailing it to us at howtosurvivepod@gmail.com. Okay, let's get back to my conversation with Vikki. Well, so in thinking in terms of like zooming out on that notion of like finding a way together, as I was sharing with you at the top of the show, um, you know, in this series in particular, because we wanted to talk about like the hard skills of survival under either like disaster or just conditions of
Mhm.
collapse. Like it doesn't have to be like a acute disaster
Mm-hmm.
or acute, crisis like we're experiencing right now with this pandemic. It could also just be like we're living under conditions of collapse, like infrastructure collapse. And of course, the question of shelter is particularly
Mm-hmm.
relevant to that, and it's relevant to this moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the recognition that so many of us um, either are currently already having to or will have to learn the skill of making shelter inside of
Mm-hmm.
spaces that were privately owned,
Mm-hmm.
under the previous regime,
Mm-hmm.
or are privately owned currently. I'm just, I'm wondering if like zooming out, you can, harvest some gems in terms of like the lessons you learned about making home and making community through this experience of squatting and organizing.
Hmm. I mean, I think my experience is very different than what people might experience today. I mean, in Oakland, at the beginning of the year or late last year, there were a group of moms who took over a house that was owned either by a bank or an absentee landlord, and I forget the details now, but they took it over. They were building housing, kind of like the Lower East Side squats. They were building housing for themselves and their children and their families. And then the state took notice and swooped in and tried and evicted them. So that was, so I think that one of
Mm.
the things we have to keep in mind is that real estate is a lot more valuable now. Like in the 1980s, it was like easier to like have people turn a blind eye to to um to that. But at the same time, there are also places and where property is cheaper and real estate is cheaper. I was in Bloomington, Indiana last year, 2 years ago,
Mhm.
and I visited several projects where people had pooled together money to say buy a house, and it was $1,000, 1000 to buy
What?
a house. This house needed a lot of work. Like I went in and
Right.
like it was very much like, I mean, it was very much like opening the door of Serenity and all the floors falling down on you. Like by the time I visited, like there was a floor, but like they had to put in the floor because they were like, but they so I think one of the things to think about is like what is available now, and then also where do you want
Mm.
to stay? I mean, obviously, squatting in New York City is going to be a lot harder than everybody pooling their resources and buying a $1,000 house, and building it in Bloomington, Indiana. But if
Mhm.
you don't want to live
Mhm.
in Bloomington, Indiana, what good is that? Um,
Right.
type of thing. But I think one of the things is to like think about what the options and the resources are around you. What do you need? I don't know if I could live in a place like Bloomington, Indiana, which is a largely white community. It's like a very small town. Like I think that there are things about New York City as somebody who is New York City born and bred that I really, that I would really miss. And it would make the fact that I live in a cheap place, not as exciting or not as,
Right. Right.
fulfilling to me. Um, but I think it's, like figuring out what the options are and then how to go about getting them. So as we saw in Oakland, uh, the moms who had been squatting, and building homes for themselves and their children got evicted. And so it might be looking at people who've done these things more recently and saying like, what needs to happen for this to be successful? Like what,
Mhm.
like what were the, and, not to, I am not saying that they did things wrong or they should have done things differently. I don't live in Oakland. I don't know the political and real estate landscape of Oakland, but like
Mhm.
kind of looking at that and saying like, like what happened in their scenario and how can we, if we try to do this in our location, avoid some of these things. And it means having a
Right. Right.
conversation with other folks too. I mean, until the internet and the airwaves get shut down, like people are fairly reachable. So it might say like, hey, we noticed you did this. Would you be willing to have a conversation, about, what you did, how you did it, and looking back, what you might have done differently? Because
Right.
that,
Like
like,
harvesting the
yes,
lessons.
like the hindsight is 2020.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because I mean, part of what you were just describing in the squatters' rights movement is like that one of the issues that you all were up against was that there were some ways in which like people were coalescing around certain political
Mm-hmm.
ideas, right? Like property is theft.
Mm-hmm.
And there were also people engaged in the process who were there literally just because they needed housing, not because there was necessarily like any political ideology
Mm-hmm.
motivating the way that they were,
Yeah.
going
Mm-hmm.
about that. And I think that that's like, it's one of the questions that comes up often for us when we're thinking about some of the concepts that like underpin this show, right? That like um that there's the ideal condition that we all imagine ourselves under
Mm-hmm.
when shit hits the fan, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like who we're going to be with and what our outfit's going to look like and how we're
Mm-hmm.
going to be so like politically evolved
Mm-hmm.
and and how we're going to have all of the skills in place that we already need by the
Mm-hmm.
time we're trying to survive, right? And then there's the actual reality, which is that when shit hits the fan, you are with who you're with and you
Mm-hmm.
are who you are in that moment. And in many ways, like, there's whatever skills we all have, like
Mm-hmm.
whatever hard skills we have, and then there's the actual skills of relationship, which in my mind are the more important ones,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because as you were just describing, like you can learn how to build a staircase,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you don't have to know that going in, but it would help to know how to be in right relationship with other
Mm-hmm.
people if you're going to build a staircase with them,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I
And
think
so there's those pieces of it, but then there is this, to me, there is this question of like how critical is it to have like a shared political lens or shared political ideology in order to do this kind of work of like making home, making shelter, and the level of risk involved in doing that work.
I think looking back, I think it is important because you want to know that people have your back when shit hits the fan. You don't want to think that you're going to all barricade yourselves in the building and wage all-out war in defense of your home, only to find that 3/4 of your building have left. This is not
Mhm.
ideal. Um, you want to be sure that you're in a building. I mean, when I came in, my building and many other buildings had rules that you could smoke weed, but you could not do heroin. Like that was
Mhm.
actually just automatic grounds for eviction. And that was because people in previous buildings, and I think maybe in this building, had seen the ways in which heroin use had ravaged the community in the buildings. From people who would nod out and like knock over a candle and set the building on fire, and then the building would get evicted, and then it would get torn down, and then everybody was homeless, to things like,
Right.
like there would be people coming in and out of the building trying to steal things. It made it unsafe for the other residents. So there was a hard and fast rule that there was to be no heroin in the building.
Mhm.
And people would just get tossed out if they violated that. So I think it's important, and this is not to single out people who use heroin as like, like somehow, like you are not worthy of housing, but to say that like sometimes people came to these conclusions to say like we can't have this because this is not good for the collective good. Like, like if you want to live here, you can smoke weed, that is fine. You can like do acid, that is fine. This is, but you cannot do these things that will put the rest of our building in danger.
Mhm.
There were, there were some buildings, I think actually our building did this once, like I don't think we had a hard and fast rule that you could not beat your wife. I think it was like this unspoken assumption, but there was one of the
Mhm.
single moms, was beaten very badly by her co-parent who did not live in our building. And he used to come and visit people in the building. He was friends with people. And after that, we just banned him from the building. We're like, you're done. You can't ever come in here ever again. But this
Right.
was important for us to have this shared value that we all thought that domestic violence was wrong. So we didn't have
Right.
somebody that was like, well, I think it's okay, or
Right. Or it's none of my business.
exactly, exactly. So I think that it is important for people to have, even if you are not 100% aligned, which, really almost nobody is, but to have these shared understandings of like what is and isn't acceptable. So if somebody says, I think people should be able to do whatever substances they want because it's their body and it doesn't matter, versus people who might say, yes, but in a collective living situation, I need to know that this person has my back and is not like high as a fucking kite when the cops come, and we need them to actually be present and engaged, or we need to make sure this person is not going to do things that endanger the rest of the building, like fall asleep and knock over a candle and set the place on fire.
Right.
We need to make sure that this person is not going to be bringing in people who, are going to like, assault, like the women who are living in the building. We need to, like, so there needs to be shared values around like what people want to see in their house. And it is always good to like have somebody who actually maybe knows what they're doing in terms of plumbing and electricity and everything else.
Yeah, not bad idea at all,
Yes.
right?
And I would also say, like, it is not always a comfortable living situation, but for people who are low income or live on the margins, people are used to like not living in comfort. I mean, I think a large deterrent for many people to be involved in squatting is that they didn't want to live in rundown places where you had to build your own home, where you would be cold, where you had to put in your own walls, where if you didn't seal up all the holes, like you'd have like rats or mice, where like you had to put in your own water, you had to. So I mean, I remember there were some people who kept asking me about places in my building and whether or not there were any finished spaces available. So they wanted an apartment that was finished, that had the walls, that had the water, that had the electricity, and be like, yes, we actually have a place open, but it has no water. Also, like, I don't actually know what the last person did to it, but like also like half the floor is gone.
Yeah, I mean, because what I'm hearing in that story too is that like you had become really accustomed to a certain level of discomfort because you had to in order to survive. And then with time and effort and collective work, some of that you all were able to eventually transition the building itself. And so it took a lot of commitment and time and willingness to learn how to like do those things for yourselves. And I think that like when I look at some of the changes that are coming for our society, I think that feels like a question to me, right? Like, do people, we live in such relative, many of us in the US live in such relative privileged and comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about like how, just how access to things that people take for granted, people of a certain like class experience take for granted, like access to electricity and running water and regular access to food of a variety of choices that they wish to have. That those things may change, and the change doesn't necessarily have to mean like all out collapse if we're willing to shift gears into like what work am I willing to put in and who am I willing to put that work in with in order to create the life that I want to have.
Yes.
And I think about this too, like in terms of the physical transition that I just made, right? Because like I was living on 5 acres of land in the woods in a country ass home with wood fire heat and like and had really adapted to a particular lifestyle that, like one of the things that's been interesting this winter living in Minneapolis is like not having a fire that I'm tending all day, every day. Like it's been quite an adjustment to be, and actually very much like a somatic like relief to be like, I can just press a button and have heat and I don't have to go like build a fire or rebuild it or stoke it or tend it. But I also have now lost the rhythm of tending the fire as a part of my daily life. And so it's like both a grief and a relief, right? And at the same time, even with that loss, like even with the loss of my land, I'm so grateful in this moment, like in this moment where I think so many people, because of social distancing, wish that they did have a 5-acre plot of land in the woods to go run away to. I'm actually so grateful to be in a city right now, to be in community with the people that I want to be in community with, because where I still out on my land,
it's not that I wouldn't have community support, but it wouldn't be with the folks that I want to be in political community and political relationship with through this moment of crisis, right?
Yes.
Because I was living in Trump territory.
Yeah.
So, you know, and so I'm thinking about that too, that there is, as you were saying, that like you want to, if you're going to be in a situation where you're taking collective risk together, you want to know that people will have your back. And part of how you know that is through having a shared political framework. I mean, it's not the end of the story, right? Because we know that even inside our political movements, people betray each other. Like that shit happens. And at least there's some, you know, I think the political framework offers a way for us to ground into what our practices are, and hopefully a way for us to hold each other accountable too.
Indeed.
Vikki, thank you so fucking much. Obviously, like there's so many other questions I like wish I had time to ask you about, like your prison abolition work and all the work that you've done around like parenting and movements. So I guess we're just gonna have to do like a part 2 at some point.
Sounds good.
Thanks for tuning in to the Apocalypse Survival mini-series of How to Survive the End of the World. Upcoming episodes will look at medicine and healing, food and water on the run, digital security, growing food, rehabilitating the land, and more. In our next episode, we're going to feature my interview with Lauren Giambrone, a community herbalist and healer based in the Hudson Valley of New York, about plant medicine, first aid, and care where there is no doctor. How to Survive the End of the World is on Twitter and Instagram at End of the World PC. We're also on Facebook at End of the World Show. You can make a sustaining donation to our show by visiting our page at patreon.com/End of the World Show. There's no better time than now to support our podcast. Truly, the more our listeners give, the more of this critical content we can produce and get out to folks. We know it's a huge ask to give at this time when so many of us are feeling the financial strain of what's happening in the economy right now. And we're so appreciative of all of the folks who've become new listeners, new supporters of the podcast, and those of you who have maintained your donations, even if you've had to reduce them. We see you, we love you, we thank you for that. And those of you who have become new sustainers, we love you, we see you, we appreciate you, thank you. How to Survive the End of the World is produced and edited by the incomparable Zach Rosen. Music for today's show comes from Tunde Alaniran and Mother Cyborg.